So to discuss Chanukah, you know how it is. Every year we come and revisit the same things about the same holidays every single year. Let's try to do a little bit of a different approach. And in order to do that, I'd like to ask a few questions that will frame the conversation we're going to have today. We'll try and make it as interactive as possible, okay? So question number one is, did you see the email that came out a few days ago from the Beis Din to explain why we have two different kinds of kosher tuna? Yes? You saw that? Did you see that? Two different kinds of kosher tuna. Did you get that? So the one kind of tuna is called kosher tuna, another one is called mahadrin kosher tuna, and it's a matter of bishul yisrael, depending on how exactly it's produced and what level of kashrus it represents. Okay, so you may or you may not have seen that. The only reason I mention it is because that's just one example, and the truth is you could apply it to many examples in Judaism of different levels of observance. So there's the entry level observance, there's the more mahudar way to do things, like a more advanced level of observance. There's mahadrin, mina mahadrin, glat, not so glat, this chumrah, that chumrah, exactly. Right? There are many, many, many layers to how people observe many, many things within Torah. Right? And that's why you often hear, I don't know if it's overseas, but definitely in this community, people will use the expression, I don't know if I'm kosher enough for you. Yes, right? Don't know if I'm kosher. I'm kosher, but I don't know if I'm kosher enough for you. That's an expression people use over here.
Israel, they do as well.
So Israel is a whole different challenge.
It's almost like a battle.
Israel is a kosher minefield. It is, absolutely. You know, each place is different, and there are different hechsherim and so on and so forth. But needless to say, the place that we as Jewish people would feel it the most is the place that counts, food. But it applies to other areas beyond food as well. So by and large, let's just create a baseline, and then we can discuss from that baseline. So the baseline is, if what you do fulfills the halachic requirements, that's all you need to do. Yeah, agreed? If what you do fulfills the halachic requirements, that's all that you need to do. Now, if somebody else wants to take certain stringencies and apply them to themselves, that's their business. You want to do that? Do it. But don't turn around and tell everybody else that they're not doing it properly because you've chosen to upgrade your status. Yeah? Are we all in agreement about that, right? So if for example, I decide to come up with a chumrah that you've never heard of before, and that might well happen, by the way, so I'm going to take some stringency on myself that nobody else ever knows. That's my business. And if I want to live that way, I can choose to live that way, but I dare not either impose it on other people, or worse than that, illustrate or insinuate that other people are not doing it properly because they're not doing what. Happy? Okay. So by and large, we can say that there is ordinary normative Judaism, halachic Judaism, and then there is mahadrin Judaism. Yeah, that would probably be the fairest way to compare it. Okay, with that in mind, let's have a look at the one and only example in the whole of Judaism where everybody is meshuggah from. It's only one time that everybody is meshuggah from, and it's not even Pesach. You'd think it is Pesach, right? But Pesach is so subtle and so different and so divergent that some people just don't even, if they have guests over for Pesach, they don't even offer them food. They just put it on the table and do what you feel comfortable, because Pesach is so diverse. But I wouldn't say that everybody is meshuggah from when it comes to Pesach. We're meshuggah when it comes to Pesach. We're meshuggah. And perhaps when you come to my house, you'll realize you're not so meshuggah. Okay? But the reality is that we have a whole lot of products on Pesach that some people will use, and a whole lot of products that some people won't use, and then you'll get machine-baked matzahs and hand-baked matzahs, and you'll get shmura matzahs and ordinary matzahs. Right? So there's quite a range. Even though there are many people who are meshuggah from on Pesach, it would not be accurate to say that the entire Jewish world is meshuggah from on Pesach. So when is the one time of the year where every Jew on the planet is meshuggah from? Chanukah. Chanukah is the only time that every Jew on the planet is Meshuggah from. Did you ever think of it that way? Right? Why not? Because the way in which we're Meshuggah from doesn't feel so from. But the truth is, it is. And I'll explain to you what I mean. When you have a look in, by the way, where in the Gemara does it speak about Chanukah? There is no tractate called Chanukah. Interestingly enough, right? That's a subject for another shir in its own right. Why Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who compiled the Mishnah, did not. He made Megillah, he made one for Purim, which is a rabbinic holiday, an entire tractate for Purim called Megillah, and he made nothing for Chanukah. Okay, that's homework. You can think about it. It's subject for another conversation. So the Mishnah doesn't discuss Chanukah, so it's got to appear in the Gemara somewhere. Where would you think? If there's no Mishnah dedicated to Chanukah, which part of the Gemara do you think would give us the opportunity to discuss Chanukah? Shabbos, exactly. Bamem Adlikin, the second chapter of Shabbos, which speaks about Shabbos candles. So seeing as the Mishnah discusses Shabbos candles, the Gemara uses that as its opportunity to tell us everything that we need to know about Chanukah in a famous section that is called My Chanukah. What is the reason that we celebrate Chanukah? Okay? My Chanukah. Now what's even more fascinating about this is that the key opinions about how exactly you're supposed to celebrate Chanukah are opinions of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, which really belongs in the Mishnah. But there is no Mishnah dedicated to Chanukah. So that's fascinating in its own right. Anyway, so My Chanukah is effectively a very brief history of what happened on Chanukah. And then there's the discussion about how we're supposed to celebrate it. So how are we supposed to celebrate Chanukah? Let's collate. What are the components we need to celebrate Chanukah? The obvious, we have to eat latkes and donuts. Obviously, right? Okay, so besides that, which is actually tradition, it's not mentioned in the Gemara, it doesn't talk about eating oil-based foods. So what are you supposed to do in order to celebrate Chanukah? You're supposed to light a candle, right? And you're supposed to say prayers of gratitude to Hashem. So that's Hallel and Valanesim. We're going to focus on the lighting of a candle. Mitzvahs ner Chanukah is ner ish ubeisoy. That's the expression in the Gemara. That the mitzvah of Chanukah is one candle per home, per household. One candle per household. Okay, we're not going to get into the details now of what constitutes a candle and is it a candle or is it oil and what kind of oil and all that kind of thing. Let's just keep it simple. Let's just use the generic word candle, but we all know that the ideal is olive oil. So we'll say one lamp, if you prefer, instead of one candle. So the mitzvah is ner ish ubeisoy. That the way that you're supposed to observe Chanukah is one lamp each of the 8 nights of Chanukah. Ve'hamahadrin, anybody who wants to be even more from than that, because that's the basic entry level. So if you want to be more from, how are you more from? Everybody lights their own candle, right? Everybody lights their own candle. Now, who constitutes everybody? That's another discussion for the purposes of our conversation. Every male over the age of bar mitzvah. If a woman is living on her own, naturally she has to light Chanukah candles. Vahamahadrin mina mahadrin. Now, how many areas of Jewish law do we ever use that phrase? Hamahadrin mina mahadrin. Those people who want to be even more from than the from. Those who want to be even more cautious than the cautious. Which basically in modern language is Meshuggah from. Right? So if you want to be Meshuggah from, what do? You don't only have each individual light a candle each night of Chanukah, but you increase the number of candles. Okay? So the fact that every household in the Jewish world, including people who are completely secular, has a little Chanukiah for each family member, and they increase from 1 to 2 all the way to 8, is mahadrin mina mahadrin. It's Meshuggah from. Let's not tell everybody because maybe then they'll protest. But that's what's actually happening. It is the highest level of observance possible.
I think it's actually in between mahadrin and mahadrin, because I think most people that
one and they increase.
Increasing.
So the truth of the matter is that what's become very common is as in many other areas of Judaism, people want things for their children. So they get their children to light. So technically, anybody who's got children at home is technically doing Mahadrin min Mahadrin, because they'll have multiple menorahs and they'll be increasing the candles, increasing the lights. Now we have to ask ourselves a question. That's very beautiful and it's very geschmack, and you can go home and say this is the time of the year that people are the frummest. Bearing in mind also that Chanukah is probably the most celebrated Jewish holiday. Right? Interestingly enough. Because it's relatively easy. That's the argument people will tell you, because it's relatively easy. And because in many Western countries, you've got to do something for your kids at this time of the year because there's so much else going on. So it encourages Jewish people to do Jewish things to a greater or lesser extent. So now we're going to analyze this from a completely different perspective. Not just convenience, because it's an easy mitzvah, it's a fun mitzvah. It's not the most expensive mitzvah. Give me a Chanukah anytime over a Pesach cost-wise, right? And labor-wise. It's not a labor-intensive yontiv. And it's a lot of fun, and everybody else is having fun, so it's good for the kids. Besides all of those, we understand that everything that happens in the world has to be the result of what's going on spiritually. So we've got to drill down into the spiritual secret of why it is that Chanukah is the time that everybody goes Mahadrin min ha-Mahadrin. Okay, that's what we're going to analyze over here today. In order to do that, a few more questions that we have to unpack. And in no specific order. Just when we thought we got rid of the builders, right? Hashem has a sense of humor. You think you're going to get rid of a pneumatic drill? I'll give you thunder in the background. Now, that's how it is. So in no specific order, just a few interesting questions about the Chanukah story. Question number 1. What is the main cause for us to celebrate Chanukah? In other words, various things happened at that time, historically. What is the main thing that we celebrate on Chanukah?
The miracle of the oil.
Okay, so you got the miracle of the oil, the rededication of the temple, the victory over our enemies. Okay, those are 3 options. And all of them are valid because, for example, we do commemorate the tremendous miracle. I mean, it's a huge miracle. A bunch of yeshiva bochrim, that's basically who it was, took on the mightiest army in the region and they won. So that's a huge miracle. And it's definitely celebrated. And that's what we speak about in Va'al HaNisim, where we speak about the milchamos. It's part of what we give gratitude to Hashem, is the fact that we won the war. The rededication of the temple and specifically of the Mizbeach, the altar, which is relevant because the timing matches when the Mizbeach was originally put together back in the original Mishkan. So that's how it gets its name, Chanukah. Chanukah comes from the word chinuch, which means the inauguration or initiation of the Mizbeach. Which is the one that we give the most attention to is the miracle of the oil. Because the war, albeit a massive miracle, only gets a mention in Va'al HaNisim. And let's be honest, out of all the people who practice Chanukah, how many of them say Va'al HaNisim? Right? A small percentage. Yeah. And the truth of the matter is, if you don't eat bread on a particular day during Chanukah, and if, let's say, for example, a person only davens, let's say, once a day, a woman is not necessarily obligated to daven 3 times a day, to daven once a day, so your whole mention of the war of Chanukah is going to be quite insignificant. The fact that it's the rededication of the Beis HaMikdash, most people don't even know. You've got to now analyze the name that, to work out that this is a time of the rededication of the Beis HaMikdash. So what's the most obvious, compelling, and pervasive message of Chanukah is the miracle of the oil. So we have to ask ourselves a question, why did that take the front row seat in the celebration of Chanukah? As he did at the time of Pesach, as he did at the time of Purim, right? Purim was first Hashem concealing himself and then revealing the miracles. So the fact that Hashem reveals himself on Chanukah is not necessarily so unique to Chanukah. So we've got to work out, why is it that the lighting of the Chanukah menorah becomes the centerpiece of Chanukah? Okay? And that's where we will express this Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin. The Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin does not relate to any of the other activities associated with Chanukah. It is specifically the lighting of the menorah. So the question is, why? Clearly, lighting the menorah is central to the message and the theme and the lesson for us that Chanukah is supposed to teach us. So we all know the story, right? We all know the story? Okay. Before we get to the story, because I have some questions about the story as well, let me ask you a simple question that surely we all know. Why do we light a menorah on Chanukah? To publicize the miracle that what happened? That the oil of the menorah back then lasted for 8 days when it should have lasted for 1 day. Right? That's what it is. So there's a direct association then between the menorah that we light now and the menorah that they used to have in the Beis HaMikdash then. Is that fair? Is that fair to say as a correlation? Now let's compare. If you do something that is supposed to commemorate something else, something that once upon a time used to happen, usually you try and make it as similar as you can. So for example, when we sit down to a Pesach Seder, we don't have a Pesach sacrifice nowadays. What do? We make a representation called Afikomen. Just as when you brought a Pesach sacrifice, you had to finish it by midnight. So we make sure, at least on the first night, which is the main night of Pesach, that we finish the Afikomen by midnight. In the same way as you don't eat anything after the Pesach sacrifice, we don't eat anything after the Afikomen, etc. Right? You get the picture. And this would apply to anything that we do to commemorate something else. So you'd expect then that the way that we light the menorah on Chanukah, which is supposed to represent the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash, should be as similar as possible to how the menorah was in the Beis HaMikdash. So when did they light the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash?
In the morning.
No, it was a Ner Tamid. Isn't it a Ner Tamid?
No, the Ner Tamid is on the Mizbeach. The Mizbeach had to have Eish Tamid, the fire that consistently burnt. The menorah had to be lit while it was still broad daylight. That was a requirement of the menorah at that time. Where was the menorah lit? Inside the Heichal, which is considered the Kodesh, a section that you could only enter if you were a Kohen and you were on duty. That means 99% of the population could never enter that space. Where do we light the menorah?
Outside in public.
So technically, the Gemara says, Al Pesach Beisoi Mi Bachutz. If you've ever been to Yerushalayim, you'll see that. The menorahs are outdoors. They've got these special glass containers, and they light them outdoors because that's what it says. Pesach Beisoi Mi Bachutz, that you're supposed to light it where everybody can see it. Now the fact is we don't necessarily do that these days because we've been through a whole lot of anti-Semitic periods in our history where we were taught that you light the menorah where nobody can see it. But even now, many people have the custom to light it in the window. So it's still a very public kind of lighting of the menorah. So it's quite different to the menorah that was in the Beis HaMikdash. How many branches did the menorah of the Beis HaMikdash have? 6 branches, right? And a 7, right. How many do we have? 8 branches, right? Okay. So everything seems to be quite different about our menorah, yet it's supposed to represent what went on back then. So we've got to ask ourselves the question why that is as well. That's not going to be our main question. Hopefully in the course of our conversation today, we'll also address that question as well. Let's get to our main question. What was the great miracle of the oil? You know this. You've heard this 1,000,001 times. So what was the great miracle of the oil? That the oil lasted. Is that the whole miracle? It's definitely the miracle. So the miracle is that they had a certain amount of oil that was supposed to be enough to light for one 24-hour period, and instead it lasted for 8. Okay, is that the miracle? So what's the miracle? Let's go back a step. So what's the miracle?
The oil was pure.
The miracle is that they found a jug of oil that was still sealed with the seal of the Kohen Gadol, and therefore was pure oil. Okay? Got that? So now, why is it that the menorah had to last for 8 days? No, you were told this before. Why did it have to last for 8 days? Because what? Why did they need this miracle? Because that's how long it takes to produce fresh oil. Right? So they needed the menorah to stay alight, or to be able to rekindle the menorah for all the days that it would take them to produce new, pure oil. Yeah, am I right, Safai? Am I saying anything about the story that you've never heard before? I don't think so, right? We all know the story. This is the part of the story that we know. Now, the problem with stories that we know is we don't necessarily pause to ask the questions that we have to ask.
I didn't know that about the pure oil.
That it was going to take another...
That it was going to take
that they found the sealed thing of the Kohen Gadol. Okay.
And then it takes 8 days to make pure
To make pure oil. Okay? All right. So now we have the context. So now I'm going to ask a simple question. I don't know exactly how long the menorah was not lit for during the invasion of the Yevonim, who will prefer to call Yevonim because they weren't necessarily Greek. They were Hellenized Syrians, basically. What's called the Seleucid Empire. Not for now. So the Yevonim spent X amount of time in the Beis HaMikdash. During that time, the menorah was not lit. How did they survive? The Jews? How did the Jews survive during that period that the menorah was not lit? So what did they say? How did they justify the fact that the menorah is not being lit? They justified it by saying, because it couldn't be. Couldn't be lit. Well, what do you want from me? I can't do it. You know, there's an old saying, an old Jewish saying. It's like such a classic Jewish saying. If somebody tells a person to jump off a 10-story building, can they do it? Yes. Should they do it? Obviously not. If a person asks or instructs a person to jump onto a 10-story building, it's not a matter of whether they should or shouldn't. They can't. There's nothing you can do. That's what the Gemara calls oines rachmona patre. If a person is in a situation that is outside of their control, then the Torah does not hold them liable for what they were supposed to do. So God forbid, let's say that a person is ill and has to eat on Yom Kippur. They're not held liable for eating on Yom Kippur. They have no choice. I'll ask you a different question. Today, did you participate in any way in the bringing of the Korban Tamid today? No. Oh, but it's a mitzvah in the Torah that you have to bring a Tamid offering every single day as a community. Have you ever done it in your life? No. So maybe we're all liable for the fact that we didn't bring a Tamid offering. It's not possible. It's not possible to be done. If it's not possible to be done, then you're excused. So why do we need a miracle for the lamp or the oil of the menorah to last for 8 days? There was no miracle up until that point. Hashem didn't somehow miraculously make the menorah stay alight even when the Yevonim were there. So now there's only enough oil to last for 1 day. Then I'm doing my best. I've got one thing of oil. I've put it in. I've lit it for 1 day because I've done what I can. Why is Hashem now stepping in with a miracle to facilitate doing something normally by natural accounts cannot do? And if you look throughout history, does Hashem usually do that? Does Hashem usually intervene when there's something we are unable to do and thereby make a miracle so that we can do it? Never. That never happens in history. Never. Because if that were the case, right now there'd be a Tamid offering happening in Yerushalayim miraculously. Or the menorah would be lit on the Temple Mount now miraculously. Or a million other examples of people throughout the whole of history. So why now? What precipitates this miracle at this point? And if you have a look in all the classic commentaries, the Ramban, the Ran, it's even brought in the Zohar. Loi Ovid Kuchabricho Nisa Lemagona. Hashem does not do a miracle unless it is necessary. Why is it necessary to have that miracle at that time? Why is that so fundamentally different to every other situation in Jewish history where we're unable to do a mitzvah because of circumstances outside of our control?
The Jewish people needed to be comforted.
Is that the only time in Jewish history that the Jewish people needed to be comforted? There should have been, by that argument, there should have been some mega miracle in 1945. Because, right? I'm saying we should have had, like as Jews came out of the camps when they were liberated, there should have been some miracle. If the argument is because we needed the comfort, then it should have happened then, or after the Crusades, or the Spanish Inquisition, etc., etc. Let's dig a little deeper. Anybody here up to speed on the halacha of lighting the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash? Okay, so let me ask you a simple question that we all know the answer to. We all know the answer. In order to be in the Beis Hamikdash, true or false, in order to be in the Beis Hamikdash, a person has to be in a state of tahara, spiritual purity. True or false? True, yes? So that's why if you've ever been to any of the excavations around Jerusalem, there are mikvahs all over the place. In all of the archaeological digs, there are many, many mikvahs. Because in order to get to the Temple Mount, let alone the Beis HaMikdash, a person had to be in a state of purity. Now, I've already used this example before, so it's an easy example to use. The Pesach sacrifice. True or false? You have to be in a state of purity to bring the Pesach sacrifice.
False.
True or false?
False.
False. So if a person is impure, they can bring a Pesach sacrifice. Is that correct? Why then do we have Pesach Sheni? For those who were impure. Okay, so the halacha of the Pesach sacrifices, in order to bring the Korban Pesach, person has to be in a state of purity. If they're not in a state of purity, they get a second chance, and that's the whole chapa of Pesach Sheni, with one exception. What's the exception? If the whole community is impure. If the whole community is impure, then you bring the Pesach sacrifice at the right time in a state of impurity. Why is that relevant to Chanukah? For heaven's sake, we're talking about Chanukah. Don't scare people with the Pesach word already this early, you know? What's the connection? If from here we can extrapolate a halacha which says, if there are circumstances, and this doesn't apply to all activities in the Beis HaMikdash, you've got to know the relevant halacha for each, but there are certain activities that happen in the Beis HaMikdash where if the circumstances are such that it cannot be done b'tahara, then you do it b'tumah. If it cannot be done in a state of purity, then you do it in a state of impurity. One of those areas of halacha is, if you cannot find oil for the menorah that is pure, then halachically it is acceptable to use oil that is impure. So who needs a miracle? Not only is it a question, why out of all the occasions in Jewish history did Hashem make the miracle on this one? The question is beyond that. There is no requirement for a miracle. As soon as that one little jug of pure oil runs out, halachically, you go get the other oil from the jugs that were contaminated, and you use that and you keep lighting the menorah. Hashem never does a miracle for no need. Well, apparently there's no need for this miracle. So what's going on over here? And this is what we celebrate. This is the core of Chanukah. Celebrating the miracle of the oil, and now we've got a massive question mark that says, well, why should there be such a miracle in the first place? Which effectively the subtext is, why should there be this holiday of Hanukkah that we make such a big fuss about at all? So let's understand what's going on over here. I don't know if you've ever met any descendants of those original Yevonim. The likelihood is you haven't. Right? The Greek fellow who you buy whatever from is not related to the Yevonim of Chanukah. But if you were to meet one of these Yevonim of Chanukah and you had to interview them, could you imagine to have such a conversation? An interview between a Jewish journalist and an ancient Yevoni, an ancient Hellenist. The conversation might go something like this. Please help me understand. You guys, for whatever reason, decided that you had to take control of Israel, specifically Jerusalem, and most specifically our Beis HaMikdash, our temple. We get that. We've seen that throughout our history. Number one, everybody wants to control the Jewish people. And number two, everybody wants to control Jerusalem. Nothing has changed since the dawn of history. We get that part. We just don't get how you did it. Because everybody else who ever invaded Yerushalayim typically invaded by destroying the place and taking all of the people captive and usually exiling us. You guys didn't do that. Can you imagine? Just picture the scene. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is supposed to be the equivalent, let's say, of the US Marines. To picture the scene. So this is the ancient equivalent of these guys. Crack commandos, the elite Shebe elite, break into the Beis HaMikdash. And what's their mission? Find all the jugs of oil you can and break the seals. Sugar. What are you on about? Why isn't the mission destroy their temple so that they have no epicenter of their culture? Remember that all of history is always about the conquerors destroying not just the structures but the culture of those they conquer so that they'll disappear and they'll become subservient. That's how it is in every single place. That's why ancient civilizations disappear. That's why when the Persians come along, that's the end of the Babylonians. You're not going to see them ever again. And that's how it is in history. And these guys don't do that. They say, no, we have no problem. They keep the Beis HaMikdash standing. And they do horrible things. They bring a chazah on the Mizbeach. Like they do really insulting and hurtful things to us. Like very degrading things. The bottom line is, the big deal of the whole conversation is, let's break the seal. Can you imagine? The Hashmonaim come to the temple, and what are they looking for? They're not looking to repair. Obviously there were things they had to fix up. But what's the main thing they're looking for? Are there any jugs they didn't get to? It's weird. Why are they breaking the seals of these jugs?
They want to destroy the spirituality.
Correct. So we all know that their assault was a spiritual, not a physical assault. As opposed, for example, to Purim, because Purim and Chanukah are the two rabbinic holidays. Purim was an assault on the Jewish body, and Chanukah is an assault on the Jewish soul. Let's dig a little deeper. If you go back before the Chanukah story, and it's a great intro to the story, you also go back historically to the beginnings of what eventually became the great Hellenist ideal that guided the Greek Empire. So you go back, you meet a person called Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great came to Jerusalem. And he was a classical conqueror. He just wanted to wipe everybody out. When he got to Jerusalem, we know that didn't happen. And essentially the story is that Shimon HaTzadik, who at that time, this is quite a bit earlier, Shimon HaTzadik at that time was the Kohen Gadol, and he came out of Yerushalayim and he was wearing all the regalia of the Kohen Gadol, and it totally blew Alexander's mind because he said, this is the image that I see every eve before I go to battle, so we don't touch this place. Alexander the Great had a very inquiring mind. The Gemara reports all kinds of conversations and interactions between him and the sages of Yerushalayim, and so there was this academic, intellectual exchange. Alexander, who was a student of Aristotle, now learning from the great sages of Israel. They were a highly intellectual nation, and they had deep respect for the intellectual value of Torah. But there was one major roadblock that the Hellenists couldn't get through. And that was, in their world, the pinnacle of the human experience is the human mind. That's why they produced Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Archimedes, amazing human minds. They couldn't handle the fact that Jews said, actually, there's a whole level of intellect that is beyond the human mind. There's divine intellect. And that's what the Torah is all about. They couldn't handle that. So they said, if we're going to continue this symbiotic relationship that we have, and we're going to be friends, you have to renounce this mishugas that you have, that there's something super rational about divine intellect. Get rid of that. Just acknowledge. You have great philosophers. We have great philosophers. Let's share our philosophies. And the Jews said, well, you may as well take away our whole Judaism. Because the whole point of Judaism is that which doesn't make sense, because that's what takes us beyond the limitations of the human mind. So for example, when you have a look in Va'al HaNisim, we say that what did they want to destroy? They wanted to destroy Chukei Retzonecha. Chukim, we know, those mitzvahs that are not logical. That was the war. The war was not just simply the spiritual against the material, or to get rid of the spirituality of Judaism. The war was to get rid of the concept that there is a divine connection that a Jew has with Torah and with Hashem. Now, one of the greatest chukim is the laws of purity and impurity. They make no sense. Anybody who's ever studied the halachas of purity and impurity in depth will acknowledge that they are completely irrational. For example, the whole para aduma is an irrational concept. As we well know, it's considered the most irrational mitzvah that exists. Even King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, says, "Amarti achakma v'hi rechoika mimeni." I thought I would work it out, and it's beyond me. But even besides that, when you start to read about the halachas of purity and impurity, it's interesting because we have a system of learning the Rambam's Mishnah Torah on a daily basis. It just so happens right now we're learning these halachas. They're bizarre. If a doorway, like a window between one room and another is a certain size, then the impurity of, let's say there's a dead body in one room, the impurity can get into the next room. But if the window is smaller, then it can't get through. Like, what is this? Is Tumah some kind of a creature, that needs a certain amount of size to be able to move? Fascinating halachas. So the entire thing makes no sense. Because that's what the Yevonim fought against. They come into the Beis HaMikdash, they don't care, have a temple. You have your temple, we lahavdil have our temples. You pray to your God, we lahavdil pray to our gods. We don't care. As long as you're willing to acknowledge that the entire thing is created by the human mind. This purity and impurity, that if I touch your oil, suddenly it's not suitable to be used in your menorah, that's nonsense. So they break the seals to make their point. The battle between the Jews, represented of course by the Hashmonai family, and the Yevonim, is the battle about what Judaism is truly about. Judaism is not a culture, it's not a heritage, it's not a religion, it is a divine connection that supersedes human intellect. That's what they're fighting over. Let's review that. It's a battle about divine connection that supersedes intellect. Or to put it differently, it's about an irrational dedication between us and Hashem. Now, with that information, let's go back. The Jews arrive in the Beis HaMikdash after having won the war. Winning the war is a miracle. Miracles happen. Miracles are not always completely irrational. I know it sounds bizarre to say that, but they're not always completely irrational. In every religious order, in every civilization, there's a belief that my God will help me to beat you because he loves me. It's part of the rational dialogue of every culture on earth. So the fact that God comes to help the Jews to win the war, no, it's a miracle. But it will just go down in the lore of the Jewish people as lahavdil, the Greek story may have their own. This God came and helped them beat that nation. We don't yet see the irrational relationship between Hashem and the Jewish people. Now the Jews arrive in the Beis HaMikdash and there's no oil to be found and they have to light the menorah. They have two choices. Wait to produce pure oil, or use what you've got. What's the rational choice? Rational choice is, halachically, we're allowed to use what we've got. Halachically, that's fine. But the whole battle was to show that our dedication to Hashem is not bound by what is rational. Our whole battle was to show that we care so much for Hashem, we're going to do things that make no sense to show how much we love Hashem. So you know what makes no sense? To sift through the rubble, maybe on the off chance they missed a jug somewhere. Do we have to? No. Does halacha require it? No. Are we going to do it? Absolutely yes. Because this is what Judaism is. So they look, and taka, sure enough, they find one. But logically, rationally, there's only enough oil there for one day. And rationally, Hashem is not obligated to do a miracle to provide more oil or to provide a miracle that this should last longer, because rationally they could use impure oil for the rest of the days. But Hashem says, you have just illustrated an absolute conviction to me. It's what we sometimes call Mesiras Nefesh. Not Mesiras Nefesh in the classical sense of being willing to die for God. Mesiras Nefesh in the sense of being willing to put everything they possibly could into this particular opportunity so that they would do it in the best way possible. Hashem says, you know what? I always respond to you, midah keneged midah. What you input in your relationship is what I respond in my relationship. So you've now shown that your dedication to me is beyond not only what is logical in the broader sense, but even what is logically required by my own Torah. You're showing me that you're not willing to accept when the Torah allows you a way out, because you just don't want a way out. Because you want that relationship even when you're excused from that relationship. You've shown me that you love me. You don't just conform to what I tell you to do. In that case, you've now released the same love that I have for you. So Hashem says to the Jewish people, I'm going to show you that I love you in the same way. That even though I'm not required to do a miracle for you right now, by any stretch, I'm not going to base myself on what isn't required. I'm not going to excuse myself from a miracle because it's not necessary. I'm going to show you that I love you so much that I'll do a miracle that makes no sense. It has no basis. There's no reason this miracle should happen. So in that sense, Chanukah becomes the holiday that represents, unlike every other holiday, which always represents dedication, following the halacha, this is a holiday that represents going beyond what is expected of me, because I'm so dedicated and committed and in love with Hashem. I don't want to have an excuse to do less. So how does that translate in practice? Without any of us consciously knowing it, even the most secular Jew, this is the holiday where the neshama speaks its truth and says, I'm going to do mahadrin min ha-mahadrin. I don't even know that I don't have to, because it's so many generations down the line. But this is now the holiday that illustrates the fact that my relationship with Hashem is not bound by how religious I am, how much I've learned, how much I understand, what I'm required to do. My relationship with Hashem is who I am. It is me. It's not something I do. It's not something I appreciate. It is me. And that's why this is a holiday that is even bigger in a sense than the menorah was in the Beis HaMikdash. The menorah in the Beis HaMikdash was bound by the parameters of halacha. And therefore it could only really work if the world outside was nice and bright, implying that things go the way they should. Chanukah we light as it's getting dark, because when we dig so deep within ourselves to find this dimension of absolute connection to Hashem that is immutable, then it doesn't matter what the world looks like outside. It doesn't matter how tough the obstacles are or the concealment of Hashem is in the world. We have the capacity to illuminate anyway. So that's possibly why it is that Chazal tell us that the light of the Chanukah menorah will continue even when we restore the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash when Mashiach comes, because the lights of the Chanukah menorah represent a part of who we are at our essence that not only never weakens, so even when Mashiach comes it will still be relevant, but it actually is the truth of who we are. And when Mashiach comes, the truth of who we are is how we're going to live. So it becomes this most relevant part of Judaism, even though it's rabbinic, because it represents the neshama in its absolute truth. And that is even the most secular, that's why it's so fascinating that even the most secular person not only engages with Chanukah, but without even realizing it, doesn't ask a question and goes about doing it in the best way possible. And there's, yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's not machlokes. You don't go to this community and they like that. Exactly. No, that's a whole different story. That's a little bit of personality issues with the Chashmonoim and what happens to them later.
In the old city, you really walk